You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast. My name is Paige, and as always, I'm glad you're here and so excited to share a conversation I had with Rebecca Clyde all about cooking for one. So Rebecca approached me wanting to talk about this topic, and I just was thrilled that she had the idea, and I'm thrilled that she is spearheading such fabulous work on creating resources for people who are in the position of cooking for one. This is something I see so often as a struggle with my clients. There's lots of reasons for why it's difficult to be in a situation of cooking for one. And we talk about that throughout the podcast episode. So I'm really excited to share some practical tips for how to make this work and how to make this work in your life. So before we dive in, I just want to say a few things. First of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for being open-minded. Thanks for being wonderful people. Those of you who I have had the pleasure of meeting in person, and those of you who have reached out to me via email or messaging, it just means the world to me to know that there are real humans who listen to this podcast. It's easy to forget that sometimes because it's all done in front of a computer, but I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being open. Thank you for being wonderful people who help me to be better and who are open to these conversations and these topics that aren't always easy to hear. I just really appreciate you. As always, if you have time to leave a review, that's really appreciated. Anywhere you listen to the podcast, if there's a place to leave a review, that's great. Ideally, iTunes is also fabulous as well. There aren't really any announcements happening in my practice other than this coming month, the month of May, I will be putting on a webinar for registered dietitians. This will happen on May 21st, which is a Tuesday at 10 a.m. I'm speaking about acceptance and commitment therapy and dietetics practice. This is worth one continuing education credit. If you're not able to make it live, you can still access the recorded version if you sign up for the webinar. So anybody who signs up will have the chance to go to it live and ask questions or to also have access to it after the fact. So I'm really excited about this webinar. I'm really, really excited to bring acceptance and commitment therapy information to dietitians. It's a really powerful way to approach nutrition counseling sessions. So if you're interested in that, head on over to positive-nutrition.com/webinar. If you're listening to this before May 21st, if you're listening to this after May 21st, head on over to positive-nutrition.com/academy, and you will have access to the recorded version, and you can always sign up for it after the fact as well, for continuing education credit as well. So just a quick review. Every month, it's my goal for the next few months at least, to put on a webinar. Every other month, I will be doing one for the lay public. And then every other month, I'll be doing it for registered dietitians and hopefully for continuing education credit. So if you fit into either one of those categories and you'd like to get a little bit more information, just always head on over to positive-nutrition.com/academy, and you can see past webinars and also upcoming webinars as well. As always, if you want to take this stuff to the next level, I have 3 online courses. One is geared toward healing your relationship with food. That's called Positive Nutrition for Life. Another is geared toward those who are interested in the science of nutrition. That is called Positive Nutrition 101. And then another online course I co-teach with Noah Rasheta. That one is the Mindful Eating Workshop. It's all about mindfulness principles and how to apply them into your relationship with food. All of those can be found at the Academy tab on the Positive Nutrition website. So thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Rebecca for this fabulous information. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this content with you, whether you cook for one or not. I think hopefully you'll get some great tools and tips in this podcast episode about how to make cooking for yourself a little bit more sustainable and realistic and positive in your life. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Me too. All right, take a minute and just kind of introduce yourself to the listeners, talk about who you are and what you do, and then we'll dive into the topic.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So, Rebecca, I'm a dietitian. Right now I'm actually doing mostly food photography, which is really fun and I enjoy it. But I also that's what I'm doing to earn money, and what I'm doing kind of, it's not on the side. What I want to grow my business into is helping people figure out how to cook for one. There's really not that many resources out there for those of us who are cooking for ourselves, and there's a lot of things that make that a little bit complicated, and I just want to help people figure all that out. So that's the really short version.
That's so great. That is so needed. I've been saying this for so long, just because this comes up a lot in nutrition therapy sessions with my clients. Like, well, I hate cooking because then I have to eat it 5 times and I don't like leftovers, and so then I just don't cook at home. Or, there's all these barriers around cooking for one person, even beyond just that. I mean, then there's the idea of sort of almost like the self-care aspect. Like, it's easier to care for someone else sometimes than it is for yourself. Like, there's so many elements that make this tough.
So true. It's so true. Well, yeah, and so this is kind of I've been doing this for about 6 months, I guess, and it's been really fun to tell people about that, because resoundingly it's like, oh yeah, I mean, that's really helpful as I'm talking to dietitians. Like, my clients really need that, or as I'm talking to friends or other people, they're like, oh yeah, because at least for me, like, this has been my life for a long time, and so it's kind of like you just figure it out and you make it work, but there are a lot of things that you just don't recognize that are still there no matter what.
Yeah. So talk about what brought you into this space and kind of what made you interested in it, and then we'll just dive on in.
It's a really uninspiring story. So, like you, I worked as a clinical dietitian for a couple of years, and I liked it because I really liked my coworkers, and it was really good experience, but I knew that that's not what I wanted to do. And so I ended up going back to grad school, partly because I couldn't find a full-time job, but I ended up studying like health coaching and wellness programming, which I really ended up loving, mostly for the fact of I studied body image for my thesis, and I found that to be fascinating. And so I realized through that I just wanted to help people, like, come to terms with their reality. And so I do that, but then kind of part of my own experience is coming to terms with the reality of my singledom. And the uninspiring part of this story, like my transition from focusing on that, which I still do, but then to really focus in on this population. I was at FNCE, which is the National Dietetics meeting, and I was at this event and talking to a what do you call it? He was kind of like a publicist essentially for food brands, I guess. And I was telling him what I do, and he's like, "That's nothing special." And I was kind of, how you go through those times where you're like not feeling super excited and inspired about work. And that's where I was. And I was like, oh, how dare he? but it really got me thinking, and I realized that something unique that I have is my experience, and to be able to merge this passion and what I learned in school, particularly when it comes to like behavior change and helping people feel more comfortable in their bodies and all of that with my reality, which is cooking for one, and also realizing there's just not that much out there for people who are cooking for one. So that's how I came about it, and it just feels really good, and it's exciting to be like kind of a solo person in this area because there's not many resources out there for people. So it's
I love
exciting.
it so much. I will just totally agree with the group, the group of people you were talking about that you've shared this idea with that have said, "Wow, yeah, that is so needed." I
Yeah.
agree. This is so great, and there are so many similarities to kind of like being single plus diet culture. And there's so many difficulties that are just inherent in the eating process for anybody. But I kind of get the sense that they're somewhat magnified for folks who are single. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think, with this expectation that we have based off of diet culture and just like this world that we live in, we're kind of led to believe, and a lot of us fall to that at some point in our lives, that our happiness or our worth is based off of what our bodies look like. And then the same thing goes for our like relationship status. Like I said, I worked as a clinical dietitian for years, and it was so interesting because when I would work on the heart and lung floor, so we'd have a lot of patients in for treatments for heart disease and things like that. And there were a lot of old guys, and not in a creepy way at all, but a lot of them would ask about my relationship status, which is like totally not their business to begin with. And sometimes I would lie and be like, yeah, I'm married, or I'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm single," and they're like, "Guys are so dumb." Like even I remember one in particular. Like even my grandsons, I tell them how dumb they are all the time, and that's like besides the point. But I think the thing that really connects these two that I find so fascinating and so damaging for us is that we as people, and especially women, I think we so badly want things to be simple and to like fit in boxes and to have this life that we maybe dreamed about since we were little. And that might be like us looking a certain way, that might be our relationship status being certain, for and then also like family and stuff like that. And it's so much more complicated than that, but we so badly want to control it.
Oh, I know. Oh, and it's just that idea of wanting to control it, or kind of visualizing or dreaming about the life that you think you'll have in the future, and then to deal with the reality of maybe that the expectations don't always align with the dream or with the idea. That just sounds so similar to dieting, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, and I think too, like these are expectations that we develop so young. How many times do you remember like playing wedding or playing like house as a kid? And you're developing those with your child mind. You don't understand nuances, the complications of it all. It's just this like perfect thing that's so like not even real.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in a lot of circles talking about body liberation, body positivity, or even just like developing a healthier relationship with your body, there is this conversation going on about how always waiting to live your life until this thing happens, or until, like, let's say when I lose weight, then I'll finally take that job or go back to school or date or whatever it might be. I could see how you could kind of fall victim to that with the single life. It can kind of almost feel like you're just like in this purgatory waiting for the next step.
Oh, it's so true. And I think of myself in that situation. Like I'm really privileged in the fact that like I don't get hounded by my parents or my family members about this ever, which is really nice.
Oh, that's so
Um,
great.
Yeah,
You don't need
and
that.
no, I don't at all. And it doesn't define me at all. But even the way that I grew up, I still had these expectations like, oh, my parents were young when they got married, so therefore I'm going to be young when I get married. My parents were able to do make those decisions in life together, and so that's what I'm going to be able to do. And all of these things that kind of just, again, our child brains kind of hold on to that, and we do that as adults. And I'm like, you know what, I'm an entrepreneur, I need to figure out my retirement because I can't rely on anybody other than myself. And I just as you said, kind of taking that in terms, or reframing it as a way to take care of yourself, because it's planning for your future, or it's making sure that you're doing things that you enjoy and taking care of yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've already established how there's really not a lot of resources out there for people who want to cook for one. So let's just sort of set the stage by, talking about how you could buy a recipe book, or you could hop online and search, how do I make, this fish dish or whatever. And pretty much always it's the recipe is for 4 people, would you say? 4 to 6
I would
to
say,
8.
oh yeah, like 99.9% of the time. Oh, for sure.
Yeah, so there's that, right? So it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I could quarter this and make this, or what are some of the other barriers that you see as far as like cooking at home for yourself? What makes that hard? Let's set the stage.
Yeah. So these are some things that I found through talking to people. And also, I've sent out surveys and surveyed hundreds of people. And it's been really interesting. I think one thing for us being dietitians, like, I do not have a math brain at all, but it's second nature for me to cut a recipe in half and even in quarters. But for a lot of people, that's something that's like they wouldn't do. And so taking that few seconds, or like writing down, those adjustments, is not something that people would do. So that's a huge issue for people, is figuring out portions. And then also dealing with leftovers, like you said, like you make something that is typically for 4 people, and that would last you 4 meals, or 3 or 4 meals, and maybe even more, depending on how much it actually makes, because sometimes they're not really that true to portion or to what they say. And then on the other end of that, leftover ingredients. So you decide that you're just going to make a recipe for one. Well, then you've got leftover, I don't know, it calls for celery, it calls for tortillas, things like that you might not be using in every single recipe. I think this is something that everybody experiences, but not having much time, obviously really universal, but it's something that still applies to people who are cooking for one. And you talked about it a little bit, or brought it up, but for a lot of people, and this is in their words, because I don't agree, because I think that this is a way that we can take care of ourselves. But it's really easy to get in that mindset of, it's honestly just not worth it just to cook for myself. Another thing that people struggle with, and we all do at different times of our life, but particularly if you're living by yourself, or you have roommates who aren't around, or maybe you live with people that you don't necessarily get along with, loneliness is a huge concern for a lot of people. And the thought of getting home after a long day, maybe being surrounded by people, and then going where you're all alone, or don't necessarily feel comfortable in your surroundings, and the loneliness that goes along with that. Money is always a concern for people. And then another one too is space. Maybe you live in a small studio apartment by yourself and you don't have much space in the kitchen. Maybe you share a kitchen with a bunch of roommates, and there's 5 people sharing a fridge or something, which I've done, and it's crazy.
Yeah, so many different elements. There's kind of barriers of time and money, but then there's also some of the emotional barriers that, like, food can be such a way to connect with other humans. And so if it's just for you, sometimes it's like, meh, it just feels harder. It feels more of like an effort. But I think another piece of it that I just wanted to mention is like a lot of times, and this is an issue with a lot of people, even when they're in a different situation than what we're talking about here. Just the element of it feels like it's another thing you need to do. It feels like a chore. It's sort of in your mind as like, ugh, okay, that's just, yeah, like a chore, like a drag. And so I think I want to talk about that. Like, how do we shift, and not maybe necessarily right this minute, but throughout the conversation, I'm hoping that we can kind of draw out ways to sort of develop a different view not focus, but a different approach to cooking, and maybe starting to look at it as a way to practice self-care, or like really enjoy your favorite show while you're cooking, or something that just to kind of make it fun and something you look forward to, and maybe a part of the ritual of how you unwind for the day, rather than, oh, this is just another thing I need to do.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I mean, we can just jump right into it. I think the first thing that can be really helpful is to assess or to look at your values. So thinking of myself and honestly, a lot of the people that I've talked to about this, they enjoy cooking. But then again, there's those other barriers that we talked about before. And so realizing that you yourself enjoy cooking, that's a really important thing to recognize, because then you know that this could, like you said, this could be an opportunity for me to relax. It could be an opportunity for me to kind of get my mind off of where, like the work day or other things going on. And it could be a fun thing. And you get to eat the delicious food that you ate. But I think on the other side of that, there's a lot of people who don't like cooking for lots of different reasons. And I think one of those reasons for people, and I think this is a place to address, and then kind of find out ways to learn, but maybe don't feel very comfortable in the kitchen. One concern that I hear a lot of is, I like the idea of cooking, but I'll look something up on the just online, and honestly, I don't know if it's going to turn out, and I don't want to put that effort into it to then have it taste awful. And that's an overwhelming feeling for people with the thought of wasting that time, that food, and then after all of that, to go out and have to get something else, or to do something else. So
Yeah.
that's another concern.
I love that. Let me add one more that just popped into my mind. Often what happens for us, and this can be true in any situation, but what can happen is we have all of these diet rules floating in our mind of like, I mean, really, in today's world, you can find a reason to feel afraid of really any food, including something as benign as carrots, right? And and you, like, just when you are having all of these rules swimming around your mind of that food's not good, and that food's bad in this reason, and this is going to make me sick because of this, or this is going to make my body look the way that I don't want it to look. You have all of this stuff kind of swirling around in your brain. I think that's often actually a barrier to cooking, because it just feels like you can't win. It feels like there's nothing you can do that's good enough. And so it does just feel very discouraging and very overwhelming. So I think that part of the process of simplifying this never-ending task of finding, preparing, consuming, cleaning up the food that we need to eat because we're human beings is really trying to just kind of make sense of all of this stuff that's swimming in our minds, and really trying to simplify the process of cooking, let's say, or of even just of eating, and really trying to connect with, what's true and what's not true about the things that are swimming in our minds.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the more recent clients that I worked with, I'm not doing much individual counseling right now, but one of the people that I worked with came to me and she said, I just need to talk through all of this with somebody, because I feel like I can't win. I feel like there's like nothing that I can have other than water that's not going to make me feel bad. And that's so overwhelming. And especially, and again, add that to a situation where you're not necessarily looking forward to cooking because it's, again, in their words, just for you. And you're already not looking forward to that. You're coming home to an empty house maybe or whatever. And then you have those overwhelming, stressful feelings and thoughts going in your head. I mean, that's overwhelming. That's a lot.
Definitely. And then I'm going to add one more just to set the tone, and then we'll talk about some things we can actually do. Okay. So
Yeah.
this is another thing that I really relate to, just as a human who also needs to eat and cook and all those things, is I think that decision fatigue is a real thing. And when we go throughout our whole day, having to make decisions about our work or our school or our families or our friends or our neighbors, and we have all of these things that come up, it just coming at us all day long. Sometimes cooking at the end of our day just feels like another decision to make. And again, when all of those rules are swimming around, it can make that just it just can be too much. It can be overwhelming. So I really see the process of cooking for one, or even just cooking in general, as there's a lot of mental work we have to do to kind of simplify and to like kind of work through any barriers about cooking we might have, or nutrition kind of myths that we might have, or and then elements of like, this isn't worth it if it's just for me, sort of some of that emotional piece. And then also even decision fatigue, kind of recognizing that as a real thing. I know I have to do this for myself. I have to think things through ahead of time so that in the moments where days are busy, I don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel every evening for dinner. So what are your reactions to that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think that's so important. And, we're talking about cooking for one, but in all reality, and I think you would say the same thing, but the whole point of this is to feed yourself at the end of the day. So whatever it is that is going to make it easier for you, that's going to make it more simple, anything that you can do to make this process more enjoyable is what you're going to have to do. For some people, that might be going and grabbing takeout. For some people, that might be maybe going and buying food that's, chopped already, or, taking kind of the steps out of the whole cooking process. Maybe that's going to be, you really enjoy cooking. And so that's your way of self-care, and you're going to take time into planning something and carrying that through. And that's going to change day to day, season to season
Yes.
of our lives. But I think it's so important to recognize that cooking is not the end game. The end game is to feed yourself and to find ways to feel better about the choices that you're making, and to feel better about what you're doing for yourself, and to listen to your own intuition. We could talk about the, nutrition and food so much, and we could be talking for hours, but it really comes down to making this practical and doable, and to make things, to reduce the stress is kind of the outcome here.
Yeah. So if we take a huge kind of step back and we zoom out on the big picture of what we're really trying to talk about here, is we're trying to talk about how one can feed themselves well. And feeding yourself well doesn't mean eating only vegetables, and it doesn't mean being really rigid and obsessive about food. That's not what we're saying. It's just, it's meeting your needs in the end. It's being kind and gentle and compassionate with yourself, and also giving your body the best chance that it can function well and have energy, and that you can feel really good. Because ultimately, that's kind of what we're trying to do here, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think, it's so easy to get caught up in all of the things that we're hearing everywhere, which in reality are not taking care of ourselves. Like you said, restriction, following rules, having all these expectations. I've been really surprised. Well, no, I haven't been surprised, because we all experience it. But, we see everywhere that, like, meal planning, all of these things are so important. And I think they can be really helpful tools. But focusing on these things that we are being told that might not actually be helpful for us. And, you bring it into your own life and it just stresses you out. Like that's not making a difference in your well-being. Well, I mean, it's not helping. Excuse me.
Yeah, I love it. So true. So Let's talk about some practical steps people can take when they're in this position. Maybe they relate to many of the things we've talked about of the barriers or the struggles with cooking, feeding themselves, figuring out how to care for themselves when it comes to food. Let's talk about what people can actually do. So what's your first tip?
Yeah. So let's step back for a second again and kind of revisit what we talked about before. So we talked a little bit about values, and I think it's really important to recognize like what do you value, maybe what you prioritize as well. So if you really value cooking and having that time in the kitchen, then that's something that you're going to prioritize hopefully and find ways to make that work. Again, it doesn't have to be like making everything from scratch, but making sure that realizing that you feel good and you feel joy maybe when you're able to spend time in the kitchen, and so you're going to take the time and make the steps to do that. But on the other end, maybe there are other things in your life that are really important to you that and if you were to cook more at home, that's taking time away from those things, to recognize, accept, and then to, I don't want to say deal with that, but make the adjustments that you need to make that a priority. And so with that said, recognizing and feeling like you can, allow yourself to get takeout on certain days, or in this season of your life, to do grocery pickup or delivery, those kinds of services, using meal planning sites. Like there's lots of resources out there for you. And if you ever felt like, I have to do all of these things, which honestly, I'm one of those people. Like I grew up in a house where my mom cooked all the time and she had the time and the desire to do it. But for me in my life right now, even though I'm cooking for one and kind of have like the opportunity to do whatever I want, that's not something that I want to spend as much time doing. And I've had to kind of work through that. Like, it's actually okay to buy pre chopped whatever, or to have this frozen meal or whatever, and to allow that to be part of your eating plan or your whatever it is that you're eating. So, a couple of tactics. Again, these are really focusing on people who want to cook, but fewer, having following recipes that have fewer portions, or maybe you can find a way to adjust the number of portions in a website. That can be really helpful. Batch cooking, I think, can be really helpful, and that might seem a little off, but cooking can be helpful because you would go ahead and make, maybe make some rice, maybe make a protein for that for the week. And you can just don't add any seasonings to it at all, and then store it. And that way you can kind of use, you can use that rice for a burrito bowl one day, maybe use it for something that like a Thai dish the another day. We both love Thailand, Paige, and any
Yes, we
Thai
do.
food is amazing
I
in my
ate Thai
book.
food last night.
Oh, I'm jealous. Oh, you know what? Actually, I did too.
Did
Never mind.
you?
Yeah,
That's
it
amazing.
was actually sidebar here, but as I do a lot of food photography, I don't get to choose that many meals that I make, and so it's interesting because I've kind of found this for myself and can see this a little bit closer, like see what other people are experiencing with maybe not having as much autonomy over what you're eating, and it's an interesting place. But anyways, batch cooking can be really helpful because you're able to have those basics that might take a little bit longer, and then you can just literally like throw meals together,
Well,
and
and the
that
good
makes it
thing
really
about
easy.
batch cooking is that it's not usually tons more work to cook a bit bigger quantities of certain things that taste good left over. So like you said, rice, especially like short grain brown rice, that tastes just as good the next day left over reheated as it does the day you cook it. And so you might as well make a big huge batch of it so that you can throw it in different things, and not have to wait 45 minutes for it to cook each time you want to have it. Yeah, so I just wanted to
Yeah.
clarify what batch cooking meant in case people didn't know what that term was.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. And I think too, like you said, it doesn't take any more time. And again, kind of taking that and what do I say? So taking that and fitting it into your own life. So maybe you don't have much fridge space. So you're going to make a little bit, or maybe you're going to focus on minute rice that, is really quick. And so that's going to be your quote unquote batch cooking because it's going to make things faster. And kind of like we talked about with batch cooking, repurposing meals can be so helpful because, having leftovers is awesome. It makes things so easy. But even the most delicious meal after 4 days might not be anything to look forward to.
Oh,
So,
yes, so true.
yeah. So, maybe making something and serving it with a different grain, rice versus pasta, that can taste a lot different and that can be different enough. Or just making the individual components and then changing up the flavors of sauces, maybe things like that. I think that's a really, really helpful tool that makes things, it's kind of merging, the best of both worlds. You're having that like part left over, but also it's something new and exciting, but you don't have to take the time to make it all over from the beginning.
Yeah. So let's talk about like actual kind of tactics for like knowing when to batch cook and kind of a little bit of a step back. So are you talking about like breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks? People batch cook, people plan, people know exactly what they're going to eat, or what does that look like on a really practical level?
Oh yeah, good question. To not answer your question, I'm going to say it's going to be really individualized. I think um, kind of just depends on your situation. When I'm working with clients, or when I have been working with clients, I think the first most helpful thing to do when planning out meals or kind of figuring this out is to look at your week. So maybe you've got, 2 or 3 days where you have meetings in the evening or you have something going on in the evening. And so you're either going to need to have leftovers that day or you need to grab something that day. And then other days, maybe you're going to have time to cook that that evening, and so you're gonna make extra for those days, or you're gonna have some and freeze it for later, whatever. And I think that is a good way to kind of answer that question for the practical side, and then figure out something that works. So I guess I can give an example of for myself. When I was working, the last couple jobs that I had pretty early mornings, and eating a big breakfast in the morning does not make my stomach feel good. I feel kind of sick after that. So I would eat breakfast at work, and I'd have something that's ready to go in the morning. So I would prep my breakfast, and that was really helpful for me. And then obviously I was far away, or at least my counseling job, the last one I had, was there was no food available nearby. So I'd have to bring my own food. And so I would prep that ahead of time too, and really focus on leftovers for that day. So I guess to answer your question, it kind of just depends on each individual person, but just realize that there's no right or wrong way. It's just kind of give yourself the space to experiment around with different methods, whether it's batch cooking a bunch of foods, making one dish and using it multiple days, whether it's buying pre-chopped or like to some degree prepared food and then throwing it together. Any of those combinations can work for you. It's just depending on the day, and then also your desire to cook and all of that. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that there is a potential to overdo this. So there's a potential to get a little too gung-ho, a little too excited, too gung-ho. And then so I guess what I'm trying to say is if you feel like, whoa, this is too much, this is too hard, this is not sustainable for me, don't take that as a sign that you're failing or there's something wrong with you. It's just a sign that you haven't quite figured out what is going to work for you. For instance, for me, I don't like planning out breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the week. That is way, way, way more thinking about food than I am willing to do. So for me, what I like to do is I like to have some breakfast options that I just kind of, even sometimes I have my clients write it down. Like, what are some breakfast options? What are some lunch options? So that you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time you get to those meals. You can just kind of even refer back to that menu and say, okay, here are my 4 breakfast options. Which one sounds good today? And those options are all based off of sort of I know we're going to talk about this, but this idea of like having an inventory, or I think you call it pantry essentials, which I think is great. So it doesn't require super special ingredients, but it's just stuff to kind of that you'll have around most of the time and that is relatively shelf stable, or you use it quick enough that you can kind of rotate through it each week. For me, planning and making a big batch of breakfast thing and a big lunch thing and like, I don't know, that's just for me because I talk about food all day. I really struggle sometimes on a personal level to just be super organized. And I would just hate someone to hear us talking about this and think, well, I'm going to do this. I'm so excited. And then they go out and they're like, ooh, this was too much. Maybe I'm just a failure. No, I want you to know there is a chance that you can kind of go too gung ho with this and have it not feel sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for bringing that up. I think a really good like gut check activity that you can do, or just something that you can do, is to, once you think about what it is that you want to do. So say, okay, I want to plan out 1 or 2 meals this week. If you start to feel a lot of anxiety about that, if you start to feel stressed out about it, then maybe there's a different option for you. And again, like you said, it's not that you failed. This whole idea of planning meals out seems to be so definite and like it's something that you have to do and it's going to make your life so much easier, which there is some truth to that. But if it's stressing you out, then that's not making your life easier or better. So, like you said, having things in your pantry is such a huge help, because that way you're able to, on the days that you don't have anything in your mind, which happens a lot for all of us, right? On those days that you don't have anything in mind, you can throw together a meal that's really quick and it can be really delicious. It doesn't have to be something that's like blah and boring. As if you have a few herbs and spices, have citrus around, that's my favorite. And that's, a way to throw something together without any forethought. That's easy.
Yeah. Okay. Love that. So, I love that you mentioned that you don't want to be afraid to just sort of experiment. Like, let's
Mm-hmm.
dive into that mindset a little bit. Just because we talked about the potential to kind of overdo it, the potential for burnout, and for this not feeling sustainable. How does one cultivate kind of the right frame of mind to start experimenting with cooking for one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing that's really helpful is to go in it with the mindset of this is a way for me to take care of myself. And again, if I enjoy cooking or enjoy cooking most of the time, then then that's something that I will bring me joy, and that's something that I want to do. Again, going at it thinking that the point here is to feed myself and to make things simple, or to make things, to do something that I enjoy. And so, instead of feeling like you said, going gung ho, and I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to do that, because you might realize that, oh, that does not work for me, and that's okay. Then to pare back. Sometimes we have to go through that experience of doing it full on,
Yeah, the
and
only reason it's
then
bad is if
realizing,
then you
yeah,
stop trying. That's what I mean,
it,
is if it feels so discouraging, then you don't, then you call yourself a failure and don't try, right?
yeah, and that's so interesting. I was actually talking to somebody about this recently, and she was saying, I love the idea of meal prepping and taking, 4 hours on the weekend. It makes my week so much easier, but oh my gosh, it's so overwhelming. And I think, sure, that sounds like it's great, and it does. We're just going to talk this to death, but I think it's important too. I, if it's going to make your week easier, that's important. But if it's going to take away from your weekend, if it's going to take away from, if it's going to be too much all at once, then that's not helpful. And it was interesting because she was like, like that sounds great, but I just need to, I just need to try it again or something, and kind of stopped her. And we talked a little bit about, the fact that that was, I mean, just the tone in her voice. It's kind of like she kind of sounded like I kind of got the idea that she was like dreading that option. And we tend to put that on ourselves, and it's not the case at all. It's just that that method doesn't work for us. And this whole idea of experimenting is something that I like, and I like to talk to my clients about, because it's a way to recognize that guilt and judgment are things that don't need to be there, and it takes work and acknowledgement to remove those. But looking at this process as an experiment is a way to just be able to figure it out along the way, and then see what's working, what doesn't work, and then move on. Because that's, I mean, bringing you down is not a helpful thing at all.
Yeah. So when I think about experimenting, it makes me think about curiosity and being non judgmental and sort of being scientific about, like, okay, I'm going to switch up this variable. Let's see how that feels. Let's see how that goes. Oh, that one worked really well. Okay, I'm going to keep that one in the repertoire. Okay, now I'm going to switch up this variable. How do I feel now? Oh, that one did not work at all because it really stressed me out. And so I think that there is, like, you seem to think that there's not a risk for kind of being gung-ho. I do. In my practice, I think one of the biggest things that I see is people who kind of hear about a method, let's just say, of like meal prepping or of doing this, that, or the other thing with their cooking or their eating, and they get gung-ho, and then they associate that with being, quote, healthy. And then when that falls apart or when that becomes unsustainable for them, they tend to sort of internalize this idea of like, well, I'm a failure because I couldn't do that thing. And I just really hope that people listening here really recognize, like, that just means that didn't work. And it's okay if the way that you approach your own cooking and your own self-care around food looks different from someone else. In fact, a lot of the people you're seeing talk about how they eat on social media or whatever it might be, you're only really seeing a snapshot. You're not really seeing the actual, like, ins and outs of what it looks like on a daily basis. So I just think keeping that in mind can help people kind of find a sustainable place.
Yeah, and really recognizing what that leads you to feel about yourself is super important. So yeah, I mean, if it makes you feel bad about yourself, then that's definitely a time to step back and to say, okay, I can do this. It's okay. And this is not the way that's going to be helpful for me, because we internalize that, and that's not helpful for us at all. So yeah, thank you.
Love it. So what else? Okay, so we've talked about kind of paring down recipes. We've talked about batch cooking. We've talked about being experimental and just being curious. A little bit about like repurposing certain components of meals to kind of cook once and eat it multiple ways throughout the week if possible. What else do you like to talk about when it comes to practical tips for making this work?
Yeah, so I wanted to get a little bit more. I've got a few other ideas, but one thing I want to talk about is, like we talked about before, the pantry essentials. So what I really mean by that is, again, this is something for you, especially on those days that you don't have, something, at least, an idea or anything, where you get home, you look in the fridge and you just see random ingredients. I don't know if there's an actual term for it, if I'm getting this wrong, but I kind of call those formula meals. So I think it's helpful to have, again, this is the place to start and adjust it as you need to without any expectations or judgments, but maybe start out with a grain, a protein, and a vegetable. And again, depending on what you have on hand, how you're feeling, maybe you're feeling like you want lots of one of those components, or you want to add fruit to it because it's summer and there's really great whatever fruit in season. Whatever it is that you need to in that moment is great, but just kind of having a couple of components in mind can be really helpful. So then you can open up your fridge and see, like, for example, I did this yesterday. So I had leftover pork from something that I made, and I grabbed that, and I grabbed a couple of random vegetables that were about to go bad, and so I wanted to use those, and I grabbed rice, and I ended up making a burrito bowl, and it was great. because I was able to use what I had, and I had a lime on hand and I had some spices, and that way I was able to make something without any forethought at all. And it was really quick, easy, and it was satisfying because as I kind of looked around and saw, I got a little bit excited about that meal. Because I saw that, the ingredients could come together pretty well. And so I think instead of, just like, oh, I'll just have whatever again, kind of look at it as, I don't know, kind of foraging through your fridge and seeing what you've got, and then throwing something together when you have a good selection of grains on hand in your pantry, maybe beans, having a few spices that you can throw together, and things like that. So I think that can be really helpful, especially, because planning isn't always what happens. And I talk about planning like it's this great thing, and it can be, but the reality is I don't plan all that much other than when I have to for work. And it's totally okay
Yeah,
to not
such a good
plan.
point. Yeah, like sometimes when we talk about this stuff, it feels so like ideal and like easy and just smooth, but it's that's such a good point that yeah, even two dietitians, we're both here to kind of say, hey, this is really messy and imperfect, and it's okay if you just throw stuff together, and not every meal is going to be knocking your socks off. Not every meal's
Yeah.
super planned and beautiful either, you know?
Yeah. And I think another thing too that I still do all the time, but like I said before, it can be really overwhelming for people to think like, okay, I want to make something, but where, like, how do I know how these flavors will go together? um, Go to Google and Google, maybe a flavor combination. Maybe you want something that's going to taste. We both had Thai food yesterday, so maybe something that's going to have some Thai flavors in it, or whatever, and use that as a guide. Like, the internet is at your disposal, and I don't have it in front of me. But the food, shoot, I might have to send it to you, to add to the show notes. But there's the the food. Ooh, it's like a flavor combination book that's really helpful, and it kind of talks about all of the different foods that go well with any particular food, to combine flavors and to learn more about that. So if you like that cooking process and the experimentation there, then that could be a great source. And this is so unhelpful, but we can write it down afterward.
Okay, no problem. Something else just popped into my mind that maybe I want you to speak on a little bit, but I'll set the tone. So
Yeah.
I grew up in a divorced homes, so I had two houses that I lived in every other week. So I had lots of influences and lots of parents in my life. And my point with bringing that up is my two mother figures cooked very differently and planned meals very differently. And I think it took me a long time to realize, it's okay for me to have my own style with how I grocery shop or how I cook meals. For instance, my mom is an amazing cook, and she has such a good sense of what flavors go well together, and she'll just kind of randomly dream up stuff and come up with the yummiest meals. So I tried to do that, and guess what? Like, I would buy stuff and it would go bad because I wouldn't have a use for it. I would throw meals together and they would be kind of weird. So I realized through time that my method for cooking and planning meals and even grocery shopping, I do a lot better when I have a purpose for the things that I'm buying rather than relying on myself to just remember that I have it and throw it into a meal throughout the week. So, what are your thoughts about that? Do you find yourself having somewhat of a method or an approach that might differ from your clients, or what do you think about that?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I, it's so different for everybody. I think because I grew up in a similar household to you. I mean, my mom is an amazing cook, and I mean, people steal her recipes, and it's this huge big thing. It's really funny. But you know, I there's lots of different ways to shop, and I'm trying to kind of put thoughts together. I think, as far as like the practical side, like a couple of ways of planning could be, Was talking to one person recently who plans her meals around whatever's on sale. So that's where she gets her inspiration, and that works really well for her. Another one, and kind of the way that I do when I'm able to choose what I cook, I'll, take stock of what I have in my fridge at that moment. And then, maybe I have a lot of rice that I made, and then wasn't able to use it. Well, I want to make a dish with that rice. So maybe fried rice sounds good. So I'll look up a recipe for fried rice. And then I feel fairly competent in the kitchen. And so I can make adjustments based off of what I have, because I'm not going to go and buy like one tiny little ingredient that might not make a big difference. And the reason I'm able to make that determination is I'll Google it and see, like, are there any substitutions for this? And if it's just a small amount, then I can probably just swap it out. But that, again, that comes from a place of experimenting in the kitchen, and with my food photography comes a lot of following others' recipes. So I have some experience with that. So that's one thing I do. Other people, they'll subscribe to meal planning websites where you're just literally given meal plan and grocery lists, and you can just go from that, which is really easy and takes that time out of it, but also, or that planning time, but also you're able to get something that's recipes that are delicious and that you make. So I'm trying to think of other ways that you can go about doing that.
No, it's okay.
Yes.
I think I love it. I think it's just great for people to know that, like, just because maybe they were raised in a home that did things a certain way, or they've had roommates who have done things a certain way, or people in their life, like, it's okay to kind of think outside the box. And in the end, it's just what works for you,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of us do, the way that we cook is, a direct reflection of, or has some root in the way that we grew up, and what was cooked for us, or how we ate growing up. And so it's definitely possible and can be helpful to follow that. But also, our lives are different than our parents and our siblings and our family members and our friends. And we just need to find something that's going to work for us. And again, coming back to the point of it making our lives easier and reducing stress, I think, are important things to recognize.
Yay, simplify.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so were there any other practical tips that you wanted to get to?
Yeah, I have just a couple. So as far as the shopping goes, when you're cooking for yourself, I'm a huge fan of bulk sections at grocery stores, especially spices. Oh my gosh, they're so much cheaper than buying them, a new bottle of whatever. So that's a great way to save time, or to save money, excuse me. And then also, that's a great way for you to be able to experiment if that's something that you want to do. You can buy just a portion of maybe a different grain that you've ever used. And there's lots of options there. So I'm a fan of that. And then kind of flipping things. So we talked a little bit about the concern of loneliness for people. And a couple of things to help with that would be, like you said, watching a show while you're cooking, maybe watching something while you're eating, reading a book, listening to a podcast, listen to Nutrition Matters podcast while you're eating, doing something that's going to, that's not necessarily going to take your mind off of things, but you're able to just not feel so alone, I guess,
Eat
because
with
you're able to
me.
participate with something. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
now I'm going to ask you a question that I think our listeners might be wondering. What? A
Yeah.
dietitian is saying eat distracted?
Well, I think let's be practical here. Mindful eating is fantastic and you can learn so much from it. But is that something that you're going to want to do and look forward to doing all of the time? If the answer to that is yes, again, sit down and ask yourself that. If the answer is yes, and you find so much value from that, then do it. That's fantastic. But if you find yourself, again, for a lot of people, that loneliness is an issue. And so that's just a way to kind of break down that barrier. And again, there's so many different things that you can do. And so just give yourself the opportunity to, like we've talked about so much here, to experiment with different ways of eating and different things to do while you're eating. And I think that can be helpful.
I totally agree. And I think when we get too kind of rigid and dogmatic about distraction with eating, we kind of miss the point. It's not about not being distracted. It's about what are your intentions? Are you doing that so that you can kind of work through any feelings of loneliness you have, or so that you just don't really want it to be completely silent while you're eating and you want to learn something new or enjoy yourself, or are you doing it to totally numb out? And I mean, there can be lots of different reasons for why we might turn on a show or a book or something like that as we're eating. And I think it's worth experimenting. What does it feel like to eat without distraction? What does it feel like to eat with some distraction? And just kind of see what works best for me. And different moments of life, different seasons of life might feel different, to have different levels of things going on as you're eating, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Well, and two, if you're doing that for the sole reason of not feeling lonely, and I mean, obviously there's so many things that come into play here, and it's not realistic or attainable to not eat by yourself all the time. But that could be, a realization that, maybe it'll be helpful for me and my well-being to, maybe talk to somebody on the phone while I'm eating, maybe to catch up and schedule a dinner with friends. One thing that I do that I find to be so good for my soul and so much fun is to plan potlucks with friends. And I love the idea of potlucks because I'm not in charge of everything. I do not want to be in charge of everything. And so that's an easy way to be able to incorporate other people, because, we talked about this kind of early on, but that community, sharing food with people that you enjoy being around or maybe want to get to know better is such a wonderful thing. And food is about connection a lot as well. And so that's a way to address that. Again, it's not something that you can always do, but it's something, kind of to break up the monotony of that and to do something that, just does good for you.
Yeah, I love it. Oh, this has been so awesome. Are we missing anything, or were there any more tips you wanted to mention?
No, we talked about a lot of different things. That was great.
Cool. So talk about how people can follow along, and talk about any services or resources you have for people who are cooking for one.
Okay, yeah. I'm really focusing on creating resources for people. So any feedback that I can get, I welcome and am so excited to see. I have a couple of resources. So I've got my blog. It's called Nourish Nutrition Blog. I share exciting recipes and tips for people who are cooking for one. My more recent recipes, like I said, this is something that's kind of new to me, are for one or two people. And that will be a good resource for people who are wanting to cook for one and not wanting to do the math of dividing up a recipe for like four people. I also have a pantry essentials list that's on my website. And that's just a kind of a check off, a place where you can look and get some ideas for food to have on hand to be able to throw those formula meals together like I talked about before. I have a Facebook group for people who are cooking for one. It's called Table for One, and that's a good place to kind of find connection and support and a community of people who are in a similar situation as you. I think, we can figuratively feel alone when we're physically alone, and it doesn't need to be that way. It's not just you, it's not just me. There's a lot of us who are in this situation, and to be able to come together can be really powerful. And then my last thing is I'm starting and trying to start this series. It's an I Eat Alone interview series where I interview women who are, eating and cooking for themselves, and some of their experiences, their food, the foods that they love, what struggles they have, and tips and things that they found to be helpful to share with others. So
Oh, that
if
sounds
anybody
so
wants to contribute
powerful.
to that, yeah, I hope it turns into something. I've only done one, so it's really new, but
So if
I
someone
see that it
wants to
could be helpful.
contribute, how do they reach out to
Hmm.
you?
Yeah. So, on social media, it's just Nourish Nutri Co. are my handles on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, but I haven't gone on Twitter in a long time. So just Facebook or Instagram. My website, email me through there, any of those ways.
Great. Well, thank you so much for doing this really, really important work. I am just so glad you're doing it. I think it's so essential and so helpful. And I have so many people in mind right now who will really benefit from your work. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. I think what you're doing is really important as well. And I'm glad to be able to join the conversation for a little bit.